Please refer to your notes as we review basic pain transmission. Now, when a painful stimulus or a noxious stimulus is applied to the periphery, it's transduced through one of several receptors, whether it's a heat receptor, a cold receptor, or an acid-sensing ion channel, or a bare nerve ending for painful stimuli. It's then transduced and then it's transmitted through either an A delta or a C fiber to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, at which point it may terminate in laminas 1, 2, or 5 through an interneuron. The point is it's modulated in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, at which point it will then be transduced, the painful stimulus, to a second order neuron that will decussate and then ascend rostrally through one of three main tracts, either the spinothalamic tract, the spinal reticular tract, the spinal mesencephalic tract, and then it will extend up to the thalamus, at which point it will synapse with a third order neuron and project to the somatosensory cortex. Now, the modulation in the dorsal horn is key. It is at this point that you could have either an acute painful stimulus, which is normal, it's reflexive, or it could develop into a chronic pain stimulus. That is the pathophysiological pain. That is the pain that lingers. It's the clinical pain, if you will. Now, modulation in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord occurs through various types of neurotransmitters. Substance P will stimulate pain impulse transmission, for example, and enkephalins, for example, will inhibit painful stimuli by modulating synapses at the dorsal horn. Now let's review the spinothalamic tract. Now this one has three neurons. You have the first order peripheral neuron, which is giving the painful stimulus, if you will, through an A delta or C fiber. It moves into the dorsal horn and then synapses with a second order neuron, which relays that information to the thalamus, at which point there is another synapse with a third order neuron, and then the painful stimulus is projected to the somatosensory cortex, and this allows you to localize or perceive the pain. Now, the spinal reticular tract, this is an interesting tract. This is going to heighten your awareness. So you have that first order neuron that comes to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and if we're talking about the spinal reticular tract, it is either going to synapse with a second order neuron that will go to the reticular formation of the medulla to heighten your awareness, or it will continue on to the reticular formation of the pons. It will synapse with a third order neuron which will relay information to the thalamus, and at that point there will be a fourth order neuron in which relays the information from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex to heighten your awareness, so to speak. Now, the spinal mesencephalic tract is going to activate your descending pain pathway. You'll have the painful stimulus come into the dorsal horn. It will synapse with a second order neuron. That second order neuron of the spinal mesencephalic tract will then go up to the locus ceruleus or the periaqueductal gray. Now remember, there's two types of pain: physiological pain, the normal pain, the reflexive pain, the pain that does not linger. For example, if you put your hand on a hot surface, you will move away quickly without any lingering effects. However, if you have a surgical incision or a chronic injury, you can have changes that happen in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord to induce a chronic pain syndrome. And that involves several receptors and many transmitters, which we will talk about. So let's orient to this slide. Here you have the first order neuron coming from the periphery. Here you have an inhibitory enkephalin interneuron, and you have a second order neuron displayed at the bottom with the flat cellular membrane and the receptors in it. Now this whole representation is the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. You can see that you have calcium in purple, nitric oxide in yellow, substance P in red, glutamate in green, and magnesium in blue. So what happens with a painful stimulus? You'll have this impulse that's generated in the periphery, transduced, and then that impulse will then fire up the A delta or C fiber, causing the release of glutamate and substance P. Now initially, glutamate will bind to AMPA receptors, kainate receptors, and along with glycine, it will bind to the NMDA receptor and allow sodium to come into the dorsal horn, resulting in a depolarization. If the depolarization is sufficient enough, if the painful stimulus is sufficient enough, you will see a voltage-mediated release of magnesium from the NMDA receptor, at which point calcium is then allowed to enter. Calcium then will activate protein kinase C, which will go on and phosphorylate nitric oxide synthase and turn L-arginine into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide will then diffuse into the synapse and interfere with the ability of your endogenous opioid system to blunt your pain response and actually increase the amount of glutamate and substance P released from that first order neuron. When that happens, you'll get a continual depolarization, a continual entry of calcium, a continual generation of nitric oxide, and then substance P will bind to other receptors that will cause genetic expression and protein changes within the synapse, leading to a phenomenon known as central sensitization. What this means is that any further painful stimulus can be amplified. So what you normally feel now is amplified.